Right now, we've got this like battle for our attention, right? Across all social media apps, across all the streaming platforms, TV, music, like everyone wants our attention. But what so many of these platforms want is our visual attention.
All right. Our guest today lives and breathes podcasts, but it wasn't always that way. I think it's fair to say. You've had your fair share of different careers, including being a lawyer. You're currently leading marketing for the well-known podcast hosting company Buzzsprout. Excited to welcome in Alban Brooke. And let's start out with that leap. And maybe you've had multiple leaps in your career, but why did you give up the lawyer thing and move on to the marketing thing?
Oh, well, Blake, thanks for having me on the podcast. I think that it really goes back to, for me, it was a big fulfillment issue. My job before being an attorney was I was teaching school overseas in Haiti, and that was a lot of meaning, but not a lot of money, and saw the potential for burnout there, and then ended up in law, which was a lot of money, but almost no meaning. There was a actual burnout there. And then I made the switch into software and working in podcasting. The funny thing is, throughout all three of those careers, I was listening to podcasts. So I've been listening probably since 2006 and ran across that there was a podcasting company in town in Jacksonville, Florida called Buzzsprout. And I was like, oh, these are like really, really cool. I was like, podcasts are great. And an opportunity opened up. And it was a bit of a leap, and I was very, very thankful and still am for all of them taking a risk on me, because it's a bit of a goofy thing to do to hire somebody to run your support and marketing team when their entire background is in law.
Well, you'd said that you're trying to find this balance between fulfillment and also, fulfilling on your needs monetarily. What is it about audio as a format that's compelling to you as a human being? What is it about podcasting and audio that actually fulfills you?
So right now we've got this like battle for our attention, right? Across all social media apps, across all the streaming platforms, TV, music, like everyone wants our attention. But what so many of these platforms want is our visual attention. They want 100% locked in. They're like, hey, you want to watch a YouTube video? Put it on full screen, get out your TikTok and scroll. Like, they want everything. But what audio, and this goes back to music, but also audiobooks and books on tape and podcasts, what they are looking for is your attention while you're doing something else. So while you're going for a jog, while you're doing your long commute, while you're walking the dog, things that you need to do anyway. It's saying, hey, can I supplement that and make that a more enjoyable experience? Can I help you learn something along the way? And I've always loved that about audio, that it appreciated you have a life outside of watching Netflix. Netflix seems to think that the only thing you would ever be interested in is watching Netflix 24/7. And so I think I loved that about audio. And what it does allow you to do is it allows you to just enjoy longer form conversations and get to know the host and engage with the content much more deeply than you do elsewhere, because it's only asking for half of your time because it knows you're probably doing something else while you're listening to a podcast.
I love the mentality. I personally can't listen to a podcast while I'm working, because then you're just mixing the audio with the written word, and all I do is write basically in marketing. Yep. So I have a hard time mixing those things, but pretty much anywhere else I listen to podcasts, because I find during my workday, I'm looking at marketing videos. I'm trying to get better at my craft. I'm trying to learn X, Y, and Z, get better at whatever. But outside of work, I listen to podcasts that are totally unrelated to anything that I have to worry about at work or side hustles or anything like that. I'll go listen to sports podcasts. I'll listen to comedy podcasts, but I find it's a great release for me from always having to learn as well. There's like that flip side. You talked about how you're able to learn things while you have your life, but there's also a flip side of, you can still turn your brain off and do other things too with a podcast.
Yeah, there's This has been a while. I was a psychology minor in college. I remember learning there's some study talking about people who could actually focus better on certain tasks if they were also doing something else. Multitasking in certain scenarios, very narrow scenarios, can actually increase concentration. And so it's actually why a lot of people doodle when something's boring, is you're occupying your brain a little bit so you can focus on your class. Or, and for me, I realized like my brain would wander, and there's certain projects that like just washing the dishes, it would take way longer because it was not stimulating. But then you put on a podcast and I could focus on that podcast so deeply and allow my hands to just go and wash the dishes or do whatever project I was working on. So I actually agree with you on you can't mix it with writing because those are the same part of the brain are being used. But that is the beauty of podcasting to me, is that it engages you so deeply because it's accepting you might be doing something else at the same time.
It's a healthy way to look at it too. It's the anti-Netflix, like you said. Do you remember the first time thinking like, hey, maybe I should do a podcast of my own? Or like, what was the first time where you started thinking, maybe I want to create something of my own?
So the first day that I ever worked for Buzzsprout was in 2014, December of 2014. I went to a little meetup in Orlando, I think, or maybe Tampa, Florida. And I remember talking to people, and there was this sense that we'd missed the boat. Like podcasting really blew up in 2012. And if you'd started in 2010, you were doing really good. But 2012 was like the last chance. 2014, it all missed. And I remember then being like, yeah, I should start one now. I mean, I could still get in. And so that was probably the first moment for me. The irony was back then, I think there was something like 30,000 podcasts. I mean, it was like tens of thousands. It was not 100. And now we have like 2.4 million podcasts that are somewhat active, like they're still out there in the world. So it was just hilarious now looking back that there was this sense of like, ooh, did we miss the boat here? It was like, no, this is the very, very early days.
I mean, even still, like the total number of YouTube channels, I think is, I don't remember what, it's multi-million. It's a lot more than there are podcasts now. Podcasts would be a small percentage of how many YouTube channels are out there. So if you're listening to this even now, you can start a podcast. You can grow a podcast.
Well, we see it with blogging, hundreds of millions of blogs. Like you said, tens of millions of YouTube channels, 2.4 million podcasts. You know, nobody's saying, when you hear your friends writing a book, no one's saying, well, you know, like 2 million books are released every year. So like, what are you doing? No one's saying that. But first, there's something, and I don't know what it is, that people have kind of attached to podcasting. They're like, do you really need to make a podcast? And, you know, it's a really healthy thing to do, to be creating, to actually be putting something out in the world, learning about yourself by creating. And so I always find it interesting now when people are saying, you know, maybe you missed the boat, or maybe the world doesn't need your voice. Yeah, I think actually the world needs way more people exploring what's valuable to them and sharing it with the world. So it's silly to me now when I hear things like, oh, do you really need to have a podcast, or do we miss the boat? Obviously, we have not missed the boat.
Yeah, it's a ridiculous notion to think that it's already saturated, given how saturated every other channel on the planet, every other channel is more saturated. And I would wager that of the 2.4 million podcasts that technically exist, maybe less than 30% of those actually publish episodes. So when you're really looking at the total quantity of podcasts where people are actually putting in the work and publishing, then maybe you're getting down to like, maybe there's under 1 million podcasts on the planet that regularly publish. So you could probably easily talk yourself into, okay, if I can do that, then I have a chance.
Daniel J. Lewis, who does my podcast reviews, he blogs about podcasting as well, actually has all this data on his site, so we could link to it. And I think the number is close to like 600,000 podcasts that meet two criteria: have released 10 episodes, and one of those episodes is from the last 90 days. So if you can just put that in front of you and say, okay, can I get to 10 episodes at all? And can they be within the last 3 months? If If you ever get there, you're in the top 25% of podcasts. You're in the group that's actually trying. And the numbers get way, way smaller as you hit milestones like 50 podcast episodes and 100 podcast episodes. The most successful podcasters are the ones who've stuck with it because, and we should really, dive into this. Podcasting is very different than other content forms. Other places like TikTok, the exact opposite of podcasting, low attention. People are only paying attention for like less than a minute, but you get a ton of exposure to new people constantly. Where podcasting, you get a massive amount of attention from a very small amount of people. And that group of people grows slowly over time. It's really, I like to think of it as actually, it's like a barbell strategy to pair these two content types together, TikTok and podcasting, because they're so different and they complement each other. But your podcast will grow slowly over time. So if you can keep hitting those milestones, 50 episodes, 75 episodes, 100, those are really big points where you will see, I'm actually in the top 10% of podcasts now. And I just feel like I'm starting.
There's definitely something to be said for consistency is maybe the biggest growth lever possible for any channel really, but especially for podcasting because it takes so much effort to record, because so few people are willing to put in the work over years to do that. You always will have a leg up regardless of how amazing you are or not amazing you are as an interviewer or whatever your style is. But that's definitely one growth lever. But channels don't just magically grow with zero effort, even if you publish. There's still some other things that go into this, some effort on the creator's part, the host's part. So I want to dive into that in this episode. And maybe I do want to dive into channels specifically and talk about your favorite channels, not favorite channels. But before we do that, I want to start more at the beginning of a podcast's life when you're just starting it out. How much of a podcast's ability to grow do you think is attributed to things as simple as its name and its concept?
A massive amount, way more than people want to appreciate. This is really well known for YouTube channels and for if you're writing for SEO that you're actually trying to rank for things. We spend a ton of time thinking about what should the title of this blog post be, what should the title of this YouTube channel be, but then we seem to not carry that over to podcasts. And I see lots of puns in podcasts. And puns are really like the worst thing you can do because while someone might find it vaguely funny and it might imply something about the show, what ends up happening is like no one ever searches for the name and they are never going to find it accidentally. The podcasts I see grow organically really well are podcasts that are like trying to grab a actually searched keyword and they're doing it in the podcasting space. So if people want to find a podcast, they find it. I'll give an example of this. My friend Harry Duran started a new podcast called the Vertical Farming Podcast. Well, vertical farming is a rapidly growing niche in the farming space. And so he identified that there was a lot of investment, there's lots of interest. He'd start a podcast there. Well, now if you search Vertical Farming Podcast, because people are like, I want to learn about this in the podcasting space, that's the number one result. And he's gaining a ton of new listeners there. So think about, when do you want your show to show up? What are people searching when they could find this show? And start targeting some of those keywords for the title. As long as it's available, I think that's a great strategy. And then 2, when we're coming up with the concept for the podcast, really focus on a few different things. Like, what are you interested in? Like, are you willing to show up every week and talk about this topic? Are there people who are willing to sponsor the show? Business and technology, they get sponsored a lot more than comedy does, even though there's lots of comedy podcasts, because comedy shows are a little bit harder for some of these products to find a tie-in for their audience. So identifying are there people who would sponsor my show? And last but not least, are people actually looking for this type of content? There is a ton of true crime right now. Is there something you could do different about true crime. If you want to get into that space, how are you going to bring something unique about your personality to the table so that people will say, actually, I should listen to this and not the 200 other really well-produced true crime shows?
I've got the perfect idea. We'll do the true crime marketing show. We'll look for just terrible examples of marketing that are as good as criminal, and we'll dissect them.
So it'd be like the spammy emails that follow up with you 12 times unless you block the person.
Yeah. It's interesting. You've talked about how like the searchability aspect of the podcast name. How much do you think that applies to episode by episode basis? Like searchability is kind of one of those big, hard things about podcasting because podcasts are still not nearly as discoverable as a YouTube channel, which YouTube itself is an amazing search engine. Even TikTok, the search functionality is getting way better and you can find stuff on TikTok now. With podcasting, it's like, I don't know where to go. I guess I'll go to Apple Podcasts and search for stuff, but that's not the only place. It's so fragmented. How do you think about discoverability and searchability of specific episode titles? So like, should I be SEO focused in my episode naming, or are people ever going to search for that? Should I just try to make it as interesting as possible? What would be your approach?
Yeah, so the title of the podcast itself is critically important. That's what Apple Podcasts uses for search. That's what Spotify is going to use for search. That's going to be a very, very important piece. The episode titles, there's not a lot of search engines or search functionality that's going to use those episode titles as much, at least. And I have not seen episodes get surfaced and like go viral or get a lot of attention. Much more often it is the podcast itself. If somebody is looking for specific episodes, I would recommend you to listennotes.com. Just a great search engine for podcasts. So it's a great way to find those episodes, but it's not as big as Google or Apple Podcasts. So you want to really focus on that podcast level. The episode level can be a little bit more focused on there is a good hook, there is something funny to draw people in. If you're going to go that angle, do that in the episode title, not in the podcast title.
Solid. So on this idea of going through channels a little bit more and sticking with discoverability, marrying those two ideas together a little bit more, I think we can agree that podcasting's super hard. It's really hard to distribute because it's very fragmented. For example, YouTube, the same place that you upload the video is the same place where everything is hosted. And it's the same place really where you do all your marketing. Like you use that asset across all these different places. People know how to search in YouTube. Whereas with a podcast, you really have to distribute everywhere else to make it work, including YouTube. I am curious, starting at maybe just what social platforms do you think lend themselves the best to distributing a podcast, at least up front? What can give you the quickest wins? Is it TikTok, Twitter? What do you think?
All right, I'll give you the answer, but let's talk about why this is super important to remember. Like, it's not a downside that podcasting is like this. It's actually, its downside is the same as its strength. There's only 3 areas where we've split everything up. And those are the areas that creators love because creators get to keep them. If you're on YouTube and YouTube doesn't like some of your content, or you get flagged for copyright violation, maybe incorrectly, or they demonetize you for some reason, you're done. It's over because you've not just lost all your content. You lost your hosting. You've lost your audience. You've lost your distribution channels. It's all gone. There's 3 we can keep, and that's a website where you can go to a different host and a different CMS. It's our email, where we can actually keep sending emails to people directly, even if we've lost access in some other ways, and podcasting, because you can always switch hosts and everyone's still subscribed to your feed. So those 3 areas are really important for creators to at least have one of those avenues, that if anything ever goes wrong for you, that you still have access to your audience. So it's important to remember, like, there is a ton of value to the YouTube model, the centralized model, but you want to always pair that with one of those decentralized channels. So with that in mind, which channels give you the best growth? Well, they're always going to be the centralized ones. We've seen podcasts like H3 or Joe Rogan do really, really well by leveraging YouTube, by putting on clips that might go and get a ton of exposure on YouTube and then driving that traffic back to the podcast. And lately, I've seen a number of podcasts do really, really, really well by using TikTok. And pretty much what they're doing is they're looking and they're saying, there's nowhere else in the world right now where you can get millions and millions of views as a no-name creator. But you can on TikTok if you get lucky. You know, in your first few videos, they may all be getting you nothing, or they may get millions and millions. Like YouTube doesn't care who you are if the content is really good and really catchy. And so I've seen quite a few podcasts who, you know, they do a whole hour-long episode, they do all this research, and then they compress that into like a minute-long story. And they give really good hook and they say, here's a story. And if you want to go deeper, check out our podcast. And some of them I've seen like literally go viral, hundreds of thousands and then millions of views on TikTok. And then they pull up and they start showing us their stats. And it's just a skyrocketing chart where they're not getting millions of podcast plays, but they're getting thousands of new subscribers and they're sticking around from episode to episode. It's an incredibly powerful marriage of two very different platforms.
When we're looking at like distributing the podcast, growing the podcast, especially through these centralized platforms, do you see any common mistakes that every time you're just like pulling your hair out and want to scream at them, no, don't do that?
Okay, so you know this as a content creator. The one thing we hear all the time is like, oh, just repurpose your content. And it's like always pitched as this like very easy thing to do. You know, record a podcast and then turn that into 3 blog posts and turn that into 12 LinkedIn things. And what you end up seeing people do is, especially because it's pitched as being so easy, is they do one piece of mediocre content and then kind of chop it in different ways and push it out to platforms. But what you end up often doing is giving these centralized platforms content that doesn't fit what people are looking for. So TikTok, people are expecting, I want something really good in under 60 seconds, probably closer to like 30. And it needs to have the strongest hook you can imagine in the first 3 seconds. And it needs to be visually interesting. And it needs to be compelling. And it cannot have a second of downtime where people swipe up and you're gone. So the biggest mistake I see that makes me want to tear my hair out is when people go, well, what I'll do is I'll just create a little audiogram of my podcast and stick it on there. And it's like 3 minutes long. And they're surprised that no one listens to it because people are sitting there, swipe, swipe, swipe on TikTok. And then they get to your audiogram and it's totally different than what they were looking for. And they swipe immediately. And TikTok goes, I don't know what that was, but it stinks. And nobody wants to hear it. So they won't show it to anybody. So the advice there is find out what each of these centralized platforms is looking for and actually start creating content for that platform. You know, you've done a ton of research earlier, but don't imagine the exact same audio from your podcast episode or the exact same video from a YouTube video is going to translate 1-to-1 into TikToks. Does that make sense?
Yeah, context is massively important. And that, like, whatever you feel of Gary Vee, he's right on the strategy part of it, but it's so much harder to do in real life. And it requires more than one person can really do in a day, especially if you're trying to do it right, because it does boil down to the quality of that initial piece of content, which it's not easy to create something that's awesome. It's really hard, or else everybody would be able to do that. And so when you start breaking it down, you're actually probably losing a little bit of quality along the way as well, because you're losing context from the full episode. So it has to start really good, or by the end of that, it's kind of like a game of telephone. It's going to be super distorted, and it's not going to be at all what that channel or that audience needs.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to remember Gary Vee actually has an agency that will do this for you. So there may be a little bit of a reason. And he knows, like, most people don't have time to be putting up as much content as he does. He has a massive team of people who are taking this content that he has, they're editing it, they're adding graphics, they're chopping it correctly. they're doing everything they can to make it fit each of the platforms. And that's what's successful. And as a podcaster, you don't have time probably to put it on LinkedIn as a great LinkedIn post, and on Twitter as a great Twitter thread, and on Facebook as like whatever Facebook wants right now, and everywhere else. Instead, you need to find one or two channels that you are comfortable working in and focus on growing those channels to grow the podcast, rather than feeling like I'm just going to take a shotgun approach and just throw tons of stuff out there and hope something sticks. Because what will happen is nothing sticks, and nothing burns you out faster than finding out all of your effort and all of your hard work yields zero results. So my advice is always find a channel that has potential that you also enjoy, and then let's experiment there to try to grow the podcast itself.
I want to throw you a fastball here and see. We've talked about how to grow a podcast. We got into it a little bit, but maybe we can take a step back here and talk about goals. So growth doesn't make sense if you don't kind of know what you're working towards. So this may be an unfair question. It's very open-ended, difficult to answer this in one coup, but we'll try this. So what are the possible end goals that podcasters typically look to, and how would you determine what the end goal should be for your show?
Yeah, that is I just finished a rewrite of our How to Start a Podcast guide, and that's at the very, very front of this guide. Because if you don't know what the goals are, you are not going to be able to attain those goals. So here are goals that make sense. You can just be trying to have fun with friends. It can be a way for you to break into an industry. So I talked about my friend Harry doing the vertical farming podcast. He wanted to get more connected in that industry. It could be a business purpose. So like your show right now, you have a business purpose for Riverside, for people to learn more about what Riverside does and see like the great product. It could be to drive leads to a business. It could be to get famous and try to monetize the podcast. It could be any number of reasons. I would tell you the biggest red flag I ever get is if that fifth one is people's main purpose. If your main purpose is, I want to get famous and I want to get my name out there, that takes such a long time to accomplish. And if you're not passionate about the content and you're not getting some results along the way to that, hypothetical famedom that you're going to get somewhere, you're going to probably stumble a few months in as you realize this isn't the fast track to success that I maybe thought it was.
If I said that my goal was 10,000 monthly listeners, would that actually not be a super great goal to put that on how many listeners I want? It'd be more about I want to monetize the podcast so I can accomplish this, or I want to just have fun with my friend. How would you differentiate between those different goals?
Yeah, whenever people pull numbers out as goals, and I think this is true on the marketing side as well, where are those numbers coming from? And often they come from a feeling of I will feel accomplished once I hit this number. There's no actual reason for that number. So I would take a step back and say, what's the thing that I want to accomplish? And then what do I need to do to accomplish that? So we have podcasts all the time that reach out and they say, hey, is our show successful? And so we start having this conversation with them. One person was a secretary at a church. And she said, is our show successful? And we said, I don't know. We can tell you're on average getting about 150 plays per episode. She was like, 150 plays? That's wild, because our church is only 80 members. So the idea that there's twice as many people listening to this on a podcast as are actually listening in person is incredible for me. And so she goes away really excited. But then there's other shows that show up and they're getting tens of thousands of plays. And we say, wow, that looks really good. And they're going, well, no, because you can only make $20 on the ad for every 1,000 listeners. And so there's no way we can pay the 8 people who are working on this podcast. And you're going, oh, the goals are so different that for one person, 150 can be a roaring success. And for somebody else, 20,000 can be a complete failure. So it's really important to hammer home, why are you building this podcast? What's the goal? And then we'll be able to interpret numbers in that context.
In your experience, from everything you see in conversations with, you've talked to customers, you just mentioning, have you ever seen any evidence to support this idea that monetizing early hurts your growth? Do you think it does hurt your growth, or does it help growth? How do you think about monetization and the timing of that?
So if the monetization is ads, like there is some truth. Like what is ads are, you really like what I talk about 99% of the time, but so I'm going to annoy you 5% of the time or something with an ad so that I get something back. So ads are inherently annoying. Nobody enjoys them. So it can slow you down a little bit, but I don't think much. And especially if the ads are genuine, they're things that you're interested in talking about, you're giving recommendations for products you really enjoy, they match your listeners, or maybe you're recommending another podcast. Things that are not too intrusive, I think are fine. But the type of monetization I love early on is asking for listener donations. There's a lot of people who listen to shows, and I'm one of them. I don't really want to hear ads, but I love supporting the podcast. And I think there's a lot of cool stuff with these active donation models, but also with podcasting is starting to break into, there's a little bit of like a crypto podcasting spillover right now where people are donating crypto to podcasts. I think all of this stuff is very cool because it's a way for you to support the creators you love without asking them, hey, let's bring something else into this equation. Blue Apron does not need to be involved in, I just enjoy this show. Like it could be just a 1-for-1. Here's $20. Thank you so much for putting all the effort in. I really appreciate it.
But at this point for you, isn't it a little unnerving if you don't hear a Squarespace ad?
I think, wow, this person must really love this podcast if I'm not hearing Better Health and Blue Apron and Squarespace and all the rest. I honestly think that most of my favorite shows have zero ads and are monetizing in another way. And at least my 3 favorite podcasts, all of them I support on a monthly recurring basis. This is my theory of like the internet. There's so much of the internet that is kind of broken right now because of ad-driven model. We see it a lot in the division on social media. We see it a lot in the anxiety with the news that we're driving a lot of like sensationalism and clicking just because we need to get people to look at as many ads as possible. And if we want to move away from some of that, into a calmer, like more community feel for the internet, we need to start actually paying for the content that we want. And so if you want to kind of heal that little corner of the internet, well, maybe start paying for your very favorite content. If your favorite podcast isn't worth $5 or $3 a month, then it might not be worth your time listening to it every week either.
It's a healthy way of looking at it too. And hopefully that would help a lot of creators create more high quality things, because that is probably the biggest barrier to entry, honestly, besides that it's hard to do. Obviously it's hard to record, it's hard to edit, figure all that stuff out. But the other barrier is just, yeah, cool, but I need money because I have 2 kids or whatever. And how do I do that? And this is one way to work towards that. I think we're probably a decent ways away. There's Patreon and things like that help with this, but making this more standard across podcasting I see that as having a future for sure. Getting back to this idea of growing a podcast. So we've talked a little bit about repurposing, and that's usually maybe the main thing that people are taught to do to grow any channel, whether it's podcast, YouTube, whatever. Just take pillar content, repurpose it. There's value to that. We've talked about how you can make that work a little bit more. It starts with super high quality original content, but going beyond that, are there other pillars of growth, let's say, for a podcast? Is that collaborations? Is it what are the things that you always rely on that if you just stick to them and do them, they'll work?
So I like to split these tactics up into 2 different categories. Like, is money the limiting factor for you, or is time the limiting factor? And which one's going to limit you first? Because everyone doesn't have unlimited of either thing. But if you're like a business and you're trying to start a podcast and you want to grow, then you actually should have the money there. And so in that case, I'm leaning into actual paid acquisition for podcasts. So I've personally never been able to make Facebook ads work for podcasts. I know a few people say that they have had success there. I haven't seen a ton of it, but I have seen a ton of success with advertising inside of podcasting apps. And we could link maybe to a blog post I wrote about all the apps that will let you advertise in their app. You can get a lot of new listeners that way pretty quickly and pretty cheaply, as long as you have some of that budget there. You can do other things like pay other podcasts to put a little promo for your podcast on theirs. Podcaster Jordan Harbinger has grown his show, I think, to 11 million monthly listeners, all on this one strategy. Like, all he does is every month he's spending like $20,000 making great content, but then he makes great promos for that content and he advertises on other people's podcasts. And then people go, well, I enjoy podcasts and I keep hearing about this Jordan Harbinger guy doing his show. Maybe I'll go check out that episode. Oh, wow. He interviewed General H.R. McMaster. That sounds interesting. And you jump over and then you subscribe to a new show. So those are a few paid ways that work. If you have time to be creative and repurpose content the right way, the place that I would be pouring all of my time right now is this marriage of podcasting and TikTok. They are exact opposites in every way. TikTok, the minute that they don't like your content, it'll never be shown again. Podcasting, you always hold on to your audience. Podcasting, very hard to grow. TikTok, incredibly easy to grow. Podcasting, your brand is super important. TikTok, you can grow a brand new brand, and TikTok does not seem to care if you have an existing brand or not. TikTok is low attention, podcasting is high attention. And they're so different that you can really get some TikTok content to go viral quickly and then drive people back to the podcast. And that conversion rate may only be like 1 in 1,000. It's really low. But the value of that is that's 1,000 new people. If you have 1 million views on TikTok, 1,000 new people that are going to listen to your podcast over and over and over again. And then they will end up being a growth engine for you going forward, because they're the people who are recommending your podcast to people and are noticing when you put out great content. So that's the tactic I would be using a lot. And then no matter what, cross collaborations with other creators are always a great way to work. I love seeing when a podcast of a specific area, there's a Supreme Court podcast I used to listen to for a long time. They partnered with the #1 Supreme Court blog because they were offering different types of content. One was much more of the facts. The other one was giving much more of the analysis. And so they said, hey, let's collaborate. We'll put our podcast on your blog whenever we have a new episode, and we'll talk about all of the stuff on your blog in every one of our episodes. Both of them succeeded because they were cross collaborating, and they're finding somebody who listened to the blog initially was going, who was listening to the podcast was going, ooh, this blog looks good. And people who found the blog first were like, oh, this podcast looks good. So see if there's somebody who's creating similar type content in a different medium. So maybe they have a YouTube channel or a blog or a TikTok channel, and you could work with that creator to benefit both of you.
I love it. There's so much to unpack there. Let's dive into let's go back into TikTok for a second. So I'm guessing the funnel that you're referencing here is simply make a small clip. Hopefully that'll point them a small percentage of the viewers, the people that impress on that, to your actual profile, and then in your profile you've got the link to your podcast. That's pretty much the funnel you set up on that front, right?
Yeah, let me give a story and example so people could go check this out. One that I've seen do incredibly well here is called the Marked Safe podcast. So think of, how on Facebook, if like there's a natural disaster, people say like Alban was marked safe. And what they do is they just talk about disasters. It's a disaster podcast. And the first TikTok they ever had that went viral, apparently there was some accident with a roller coaster at like some amusement park. And so they tell this story, and it's so dramatic, and it's talking about the roller coaster stopping on the tracks, and then the next roller coaster is going and is coming at them, and what everyone was feeling. And they've got some clips of interviews, and you're like, oh my gosh. And they tell the story in 1 minute, And then they go, you want to hear the rest of the story, like more about what happened and other crazy stories and stuff that happened? Check out the Mark Safe podcast. And they move on. And it's back into the show because they realized and then all of a sudden, that one clip, they were getting 5,000 views, 5,000 views, 5,000 views. And then this one, very similar, all of a sudden got, I want to say 3 million views. And they just saw an incredible growth in the podcast. And then they started building followers and tons of people on TikTok and on the podcast. So, making the trail explicit, check out the link in my bio, that stuff is good. But remember, you've got to give all the story, really make the piece of content for TikTok really good for TikTok, or else TikTok is not going to show it to people because they'll go, all you're trying to do is get people to leave. We're going to show stuff that's all about helping us out.
And there are different formats at play too here. So if the concept of your show is a talking head where it's just you, that's going to look a lot different than if it's an interview where you can go back and forth. And that's going to look a lot different than if it's more of storytelling, really moving you through, like a true crime or like this Mark Safe podcast that you mentioned. Have you seen one of those working better than others? With the storytelling, you may not actually have a lot of video to work with. You might have to work with more stock footage, which could be challenging.
Yeah, the way they're doing theirs in particular is they find a lot of images of the event and they're kind of think of Ken Burns style. They're telling the story and it's very intense. And maybe there's a talking head because TikTok allows you to do that sometimes. But then they're moving through images. And so you're getting all the emotional reaction to this incredible story. And you're kind of at the end of it, that's nuts. I got to show this to my friend. But I also need to go maybe check out this podcast. One thing to remember is the conversion rate will always be low if you're reaching out to people on Facebook or on Twitter or on Instagram or TikTok and say, come listen to a podcast. You don't have any clue that these people like podcasts. Only something like 60% of Americans have ever listened to a podcast. Only 1 in 3 listens on a monthly basis. So a bunch of them have never listened to a podcast. And then a bunch of the ones that have may not be interested in a new show right now. And then what percent are actually going to click through, find it, subscribe, and listen continually? So the rate is low, which is why I'm looking for channels that provide incredible growth opportunities, because we need a ton of opportunities to get in front of people to get even a handful of consistent ongoing listeners.
It's so interesting thinking about the history of the old guard of promoting your podcast. I think was more like the Dream 100 type scenario where you identify Facebook communities and then you you dive into them, try to provide value, whatever that means, for a couple weeks, and then you promote your podcast or whatever you're building. Then there was kind of this not so old guard where you create audiograms. That was a couple years ago, was really big. You do audiograms, just share clips and repurpose as much as you can. And now it seems like it is going much more the way of, if you're not doing short form video, you're missing the boat. That's where it's at now. And it seems like a more effective way to get in front of people as well, because you're not creating something that new. You're showing a snippet of what they could have in its full form instead of just going randomly to places and hoping for the best.
So before we got on the podcast, maybe 4 minutes before, I jotted down a handful of ideas of things that work growing podcasts and things that don't. And the two that I wrote down that I'm these don't work right now, they used to work, is that Facebook group strategy and the audiograms. It's not like nobody can get those to work, but those are much harder now because they're oversaturated. There's nothing more annoying than you are in a Facebook group and you ask a question, a specific question. Hey, I'm having a hard time understanding, this thing with Google Ads and acquiring new customers. And someone goes, oh, you should check out this podcast. Oh, okay, but what's the answer? Oh yeah, here's the link to the episode. And you're like, I know that Google exists. I'm in a community for a reason. And the reason is not for other people to Google things and give me links or to promote their personal links. The reason I'm here is because I want to connect with people who are willing to take the time and actually provide value. And then the audiogram one is funny because you often get people who are just kind of grabbing a random clip of their podcast and throwing up a little bit of a visual element on Twitter. That can work, but you've got to really be thoughtful about this is part of a much larger Twitter strategy, not just endlessly promoting naked links to podcast episodes with a little bit of a snippet of audio. That's not providing much value, and it's lacking the context of what people are looking for on Twitter. So those are two strategies now that I keep hearing about, and Facebook ads is probably the third. I hear about all the time, and yet I'm not seeing those be successful anymore. There's many more tactics that yield much better results. YouTube focus, SEO focus, focusing on TikTok. Those things are working really well right now. I would be focusing on those. I would be avoiding some of those other strategies.
Yeah, to me, it boils down to the things that don't work are usually the things that come across as more selfish or easy for the host to promote. Yeah. So if you're just pushing links, for example, or pushing clips that aren't really that good, it's pretty selfish. You're demanding time for essentially nothing of value. Whereas if you put the work in on the front end and you make clips that are really targeted or very easy to flip through and provide some kind of boost or spark initially, there's value in that, and there's kind of an incentive to go forward and check out the podcast. But the more selfish you are with how you promote, the less likely it is that you'll be successful, in my experience, just because people see right through that stuff. You're not fooling anybody. If you're pushing a link, people know you put zero effort into that. That's the bare minimum. You mentioned YouTube as well. I want to touch on this kind of as maybe a final thing for growth. There are mixed feelings about this. There are people that say YouTube's a good channel to distribute a podcast because you can add that visual element as well. There are a lot of other people that will die on the hill that YouTube sucks for podcasting, and that it basically, like, you can upload all you want, you can do clips, but it's really hard. Where do you fall in that camp, and how if you had to make YouTube work as a secondary distribution channel for your podcast, how would you actually make it work?
We have podcasts I've produced for Buzzsprout for a few years. For a long time, we used Riverside to create clips, and we were putting up clips, we're putting up full episodes, and they were growing a YouTube channel, and we were growing the podcast because of that. We ended up stopping it because we were talking about the podcasting industry, and we were realizing we were getting a little overly focused on the visual component. We were putting a lot of effort into creating these videos, and instead we wanted to be focusing on making a great podcast because that was more aligned with our business purposes. So we ended up shutting that down. But it happens over and over. YouTube is one of the most popular podcasting platforms. Some people may say it doesn't have an RSS feed, so it's not a podcast platform. We can debate all that stuff, and YouTube might roll things out to change all of that. But yeah, YouTube's a great way to grow a podcast, especially if you're using a tool like Riverside to record video content for it. I am not a fan. A feature Buzzsprout will never make is take a audio only podcast and make like a little audiogram for 2 hours and put that up on YouTube. Like, that makes no sense to me. I think that's very silly. What really makes sense is let's record this conversation as a video and then put the video up on YouTube and take the audio and put that on a podcast. I think that is a great combination because now the video that's the right context for YouTube. And you can be doing lots of interesting things with that video. You can be switching between, who the camera is focused on. If we start talking about an article, you could actually show the article. I mean, think about what Joe Rogan did forever. They're always pulling up visuals, and you're seeing famous people, and you're seeing reactions. Like, the visual component is a lot of what's happening on YouTube. So it works, but you need to have the visual component. And then the second piece of the YouTube strategy is cutting things up into clips, because a 2-hour YouTube video is intimidating. It can take a long time to get into. But if you have a 2-hour conversation or an hour like we've just had, you can look at that and say, actually, yeah, it was a good 45 minutes when it's a podcast, but there's this 3 minutes that was really solid. Here's another 5-minute segment I really enjoyed. Cut those into clips and put those on their own YouTube clips channel. And maybe 1 or 2 of those catches on and starts ranking for something or is recommended a bunch. And those clips can drive people to the full video, and that full video can drive people to the podcast.
My final question for everybody is the most vague question I could possibly ask, and it is such as on purpose. So I just want to follow up with you and see if there is anything that was not discussed in this podcast that is still top of mind for you, or if you have any final thoughts.
What should the distribution be between creating content and marketing that content? And for some people, it may be focus almost all on the content because that's what you enjoy, but you then need to have a purpose for the podcast that may be comfortable with only 50 listeners. And that's not a small number, by the way. Like, if 50 people showed up for me to give a talk every week, I would still show up. I'd be excited if that was happening in person. So go ahead and, if that's your reason, you may not need to spend a lot of time marketing. But for a lot of creators, I think it's almost like a 50-50 split. You're creating great content, and then on the other side, maybe half of your time is spent marketing that content. So repurposing it for TikTok or YouTube, or spending time to make a little money to run some ads. So try to find a good balance for you that works with your podcasting purpose. And just remember, if you are doing work on marketing your podcast and try new things, it will grow. But if you're not, don't expect super fast growth for quite a while.
Alban, want to thank you again for your thoughtful responses. Taught us a lot here, taught me a lot. I'm going to steal a ton of this information for this podcast. So thanks for being my personal consultant today. I really appreciate that. Do you have any parting words, anything that you want to chat about, what you're working on with Buzzsprout or with yourself, just on your own?
A lot of this is top of mind because some of these are problems we are trying to solve. So maybe in the next few months, we will have some solutions for people to help you actually start monetizing and growing your podcasts more effectively. So stay tuned. And if anyone ever has questions or just wants to connect, I'm pretty active on Twitter at Alban Brooke. And I'd love if you reach out and tell me what you think of the show. And if there's anything I can do to help, I always love to do that. So that's the best place to find me.
Awesome. Alban Brooke, everybody, thank you so much for hopping on.
Thanks, Blake.